So typically I do a reading before the homily, but today I've chosen to reverse the order, and I'm going to do the homily first and a reading later. And it'll be obvious because I'm not so sure that if I did the reading first, I'd be able to do the homily afterwards. And it'll be obvious the reasons for it. So I'm going to start with the homily. A few days ago, I was going through a whole bunch of old photographs. And I came across this beautiful photograph, which was taken in 1995. And at that stage, I was still working in the parish in Palo Alto. And one of the things I loved to do was to do house masses. Instead of just having masses in the church, you know, I go from different houses of friends of mine and celebrate mass in their homes. And this particular mass was on Holy Thursday, 1995. And it was in the home of Lou and Marion Schaefer. And I looked at the photograph and I recognized a lot of old characters, including Bob Ullman is in the photograph and Nina is in the photograph. And it was Holy Thursday. And obviously there was the ceremony of the washing of the feet. And typically what we did was everybody got a chance to wash somebody else's feet. And so as soon as your feet were washed, you were next to wash somebody else's feet, so that everybody in the group washed somebody's feet and had their feet washed. And I always remember that when it came to Lou Schaefer to have his feet washed, the person who chose to wash his feet was his own daughter, Maria. And Maria, for those of you who knew her, had long, long, long hair down to her waist. So she washed her father's feet, and then she unfurled her hair and she dried his feet with her hair. And it took everybody back 2,000 years, back in the time of Jesus and Maria Magdalena. And so in some senses, it was like a time warp. Like we all became time travelers in that instance. And we were back, you know, in Israel of the time of Jesus. So we're coming up now to that same period of time. The next few weeks, you know, we're going to have the Palm Sunday and then Holy Thursday and then Good Friday and Easter Sunday. And typically I take a theme for a month. And so the theme I've chosen for this month is, I call it the last week in the life of Jesus. So I'm going to go through the main events of the last week of his life. And that's going to take me out of sync a little bit with the dates involved. So we just have to forget about the dates because next Sunday would be Palm Sunday and then the 17th would be Easter Sunday. But I'm going to get them out of sync a little bit so I can treat of 4 main or maybe 5 main events. So the theme will be the last week in the life of Jesus. So today, April the 3rd, I'm going to talk about Palm Sunday and Holy Thursday and Transfiguration. And then April the 10th, I'm going to talk about Good Friday and Easter Sunday, although I'll be a week ahead of Easter Sunday at that stage. And then April 17th, which is actually Easter Sunday, I'll do a recap of the 2 previous homilies and follow it with a Q&A. Now, as we go through the stories attached to these extraordinary events, I've said to you many, many times that there are 3 ways of unpacking any great story, particularly a story from a wisdom tradition or from a scriptural tradition. The first way is literally, that you literally interpret the story for what it appears to be saying. The second way of doing it is to interpret it symbolically. But the third way is to interpret it mystically. And when you learn how to interpret stories mystically, the stories themselves become archetypes. And they become archetypes particularly in 2 ways. They become archetypes of history itself, cross-culturally, because you get the same motifs and the same lessons happening again and again and again in all of the cultures of the world throughout all of human history. And so as you learn to unpack the stories of this last week, mystically, you're not just talking about events that happened 2,000 years ago in Galilee, you're talking about what happens throughout human history again and again and again. So there are archetypes of history itself. And then there are archetypes of the self, your self. Because all of the characters you're going to meet, you know, over the next few weeks, whether it's Jesus or Mary of Magdala or Mother Mary or John or Judas or Peter or Herod or Pilate, all of these characters, in some senses, are within each one of us. Every single one of us is a pantheon of possibilities. And so the stories then become archetypes of the self. And each one of us can take each of the characters as the stories unfold and say, in what sense, am I like X, or in what sense am I like Y? And some of the comparisons, are going to make us feel, less than perfect, and others will give us encouragement for the journey. But none of this is about a judgment. It's about realizing that if we are fractals of source, then in some sense, we're also fractals of each other. That every single one of us is capable of being any one of these characters, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And the journey is about aligning with the light rather than with the darkness, which is possible for every single one of us. And so obviously, as we go through these stories, I'll be focusing on the mystical aspect of it. And so today then, I'll pick up 3 aspects of the last week of Jesus' life. I'll pick up on the stories of Palm Sunday. And then I'll pick up stories about the Transfiguration, and then finally stories about Holy Thursday itself. So let's begin with Palm Sunday. Palm Sunday is famous for a procession. But in actual fact, if you know the history of the time, it's famous not for just one procession, it's famous for 2 processions. Because there were 2 processions arrived in Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. And so when you read the scriptures, the Palm Sunday scene described in the Gospels is a very powerful juxtapositioning of secular and spiritual powers. Because every Passover, the Roman governor, in this instance it would have been Pilate, would lead heavily armed troops from Caesarea Philippi, which was a big city on the Mediterranean coast, and he'd come down to Jerusalem on his war charger, leading his battle-hardened troops, and he'd come in through the western gate of Jerusalem to take occupation of what was called the Fortress Antonia. And the Fortress Antonia was a Roman garrison right overlooking the temple courtyard of the Jewish temple, to keep an eye on the rest of Jews during this period. Because the Feast of Passover was the memorial of a great escape from another great empire, the Egyptian Empire, about the year 1250 BCE, where they escaped from the Egyptians. And so they're remembering this every Passover, and the Romans are really, really, concerned that it might give rise to another rebellion. And so Pilate would take occupancy of the Fortress Antonia, which is literally looking down into the courtyard of the temple, keeping an eye on the rest of Jews. And he had all his troops with him. So Herod is marching in through the western gate on his war charger, all bedecked, with all of his soldiers armed to the teeth. Now, for the duration of the Passover festival, which went on for about a week, the population of Jerusalem, which was typically about 40,000 people, would swell to 1.5 million people, as people from all over the country and all over the diaspora, Jews in diaspora, would descend in Jerusalem. Now, so you had this huge tented slum surrounding the holy city itself. So you can imagine the Romans are really, really nervous. They've got 1.5 million people celebrating a previous exodus from a previous colonial power. So they made a great, show of their military might. And so you got this huge procession coming in from the western gate of Jerusalem. At the very same time, you have Jesus coming in, riding on a borrowed donkey in a simple, seamless tunic that had been woven by his own mother. And he's coming in through the eastern gate, the opposite side of the city. And he's accompanied by a disorganized, noisy mob whose only weapons are palm branches. And so that's the juxtaposition that you have to kind of keep in mind as you think about this Palm Sunday event. And I want to inject a little bit of humor here right now, because for all of you cat lovers out there, do you know how many times cats are mentioned in the entire Bible? Twice. Dogs do a little bit better. Dogs are mentioned 40 times in the scriptures. But if you love donkeys, you're in business, because donkeys are mentioned 444 times. So donkeys were a big deal. Cats, not at all. Dogs, a little bit better. So in some senses, Jesus is very comfortable around donkeys. In some senses, he began his life on a donkey and he ended his life on a donkey. He begins very, very early on as a little infant. He's taken by Joseph and Mary into Egypt to flee Herod's wrath, who was trying to kill all the male children in Bethlehem of 2 years and younger. So he's escaping death on a donkey going into Egypt as a little neonate. And now, 33 years later, another procession on another donkey in order to embrace death. So he starts his life on a donkey and he's going to end his life on a donkey. So that's kind of the backstory to the procession. Now, depending on which of the Gospels you're reading, the timing of the next event either happens at the beginning of his ministry or at the very end. And it's the clearing of the temple. And I prefer the idea that it's happening at the very, very end of his ministry. And when I think about it, I think there are basically three reasons for this story of Jesus clearing the temple. The first one had to do with the fact of the animal sacrifice. There was non-stop animal sacrifice happening in the temple, morning and night for all of the rituals. And so I want you just to imagine what it actually was like to be in the temple, and to think you could be praying in the temple. There's the constant screaming of animals who are being led to the slaughter. There's blood, there's offal, there's the stench, and there are flies constantly around the stuff that's just being killed. And this allegedly is the house of God. This is the sometimes God who demanded, animal sacrifice, if not human sacrifice. So in some senses, Jesus is clearing the temple of that notion that shedding animal blood, and screaming animals, surrounded by flies, that somehow is pleasing to God. So the temple needs to be cleared of that kind of mishigas. Secondly, there's money laundering going on in the temple, because the coin of the realm was the denarius, which was the Roman coin with the Caesar's, imprint on it. But when you went to the temple to buy an animal, to give it to the priest so they could cut his throat and shed his blood, you couldn't buy an animal with the denarius because it wasn't kosher. So you had to change the denarius for shekels. So there are money launderers sitting in the temple who are trading denarius and shekels. You go in with your denarius, you change it for shekels, and they're going to charge you interest for that. And then you go to the priest, you give him the shekels, you buy the animal, and then the priest slaughters it, and there's this mayhem. So that's the second thing that he's trying to clear up here, the money laundering that's going on. And the third thing perhaps is the legalism of the system of which he's a part. There's 613 precepts, the breach of any one of which could, create the wrath of God. And Christ is said, there's only one law. It is the law of love. And it's interesting that the most Jesus-like character, in the Hebrew scriptures for me is Jeremiah, who flourished about 600 years before Jesus. And he said exactly the same thing. He said, in the days to come, there will be a new law, not written on stone, but written on your heart. So here's Jesus in some senses. The clearing of the temple has these three meanings for me. It's the end of animal sacrifice. It's the end of money laundering, and it's the end of legalism. And instead you can have mystical spirituality. Now, unfortunately, Christian churches kept repeating the same mistakes again and again and again. The Christian churches needed to be cleared. Not very successfully, unfortunately. You had St. Francis around the year 1200 desperately trying to clear the temple of the Roman Catholic Church at the time. And for a little period of time, he seemed to be succeeding, and then it went back to business as usual. In 1517, you had Martin Luther nailing his 95 theses on the cathedral door, trying to clean up the Catholic Church, which was selling indulgences in order to repair St. Peter's. And in 1962 to 1965, you had Vatican II in the church trying to clear up what had happened over the previous few hundred years. So again and again and again, there is a need to clear the temple. And it is true in our own times. All the temples need to be cleansed, whether they're secular temples or whether they're religious temples. So that's my hit on what the clearing of the temple might have meant. When I look then at the notion of transfiguration, I have this belief system that transfiguration was like a dress rehearsal for resurrection. If you remember the story, Jesus took three of his disciples, Peter, James, and John, up into the top of a mountain, and he was transfigured before them. And his face became luminous, was shiny. It was like his light body was emanating through his space suit. And they saw two people speaking with Jesus, Moses, who had died in 1210 BCE, and Elijah, who died about 850 BCE. And so in some senses, Jesus is becoming a time traveler. And the vision is so powerful that the three apostles can also see these other characters. And it's like as if the soul, the very soul of Jesus, is effulgently moving through a spacesuit and radiating light into the environment. Now, why did he meet these two characters? For several reasons, because Moses and Elijah are the archetypes of the Hebrew scriptures. The Pharisees believed there were three parts to the scriptures. There was the law, the prophets, and the writings. The priests did not believe in the writings. The writings happened in the time of the Babylonian captivity. So the priests did not accept those as, scriptural. They believed only in the law and in the prophets. And the archetype of the law was Moses, and the archetype of the prophets was Elijah, the first of the prophets. So in some senses, Jesus is having an encounter with his own religious tradition. Moses is the great liberator, the one who allegedly brought the people of Israel out of slavery after 430 years into freedom in the land of Canaan. And he's also the giver of Torah. He's the one allegedly who wrote the first 5 books of the scriptures. And he's the one who allegedly received the covenant from God on Mount Sinai. And Elijah, who flourished about the year 850 BC, he's the first of the prophets. And I keep telling you that the function of the prophet is not to predict the future, it is to prevent the future. It is not to kind of foretell the future, it is to forestall the future. So the real purpose of the prophet is to call people back into the covenant with God. It is to call us back into the purpose of our mission, to come back into alignment with that mission. And so they represent those two facets of Jesus' own religious tradition. Now, the thing is, when you look back and you read actually the scriptural traditions of these two men, they were extraordinarily violent men, who engaged in murder and mayhem, but they were people of their times. And they're symbols in some senses, apart from, the physicality of physical murder. In some senses, they're meant to be liberators and prophetic individuals. Now, Jesus will be a very different kind of a liberator. He'll give a very different kind of a law, and he certainly will not be a man of violence. So Jesus is attempting to liberate spirituality from mere man-made religions. He's trying to move the system from legalism to love, to move it from violence to forgiveness, and to move it from a theology of a punitive God to a gentle Abba figure. So for me, that's what Transfiguration means to me. This was Jesus' attempt to move the ball forward from mere dogmatic religion into mystical spirituality. Which brings me then to Holy Thursday. So it's interesting that according to the scriptures, that Holy Thursday was the occasion for the institution of 3 different sacraments. Now, typically, we only think there were 2 instituted at that stage. So the first one is the Sacrament of Eucharist, where he feeds us from his own body and blood. Now, as I've said many, many times, this is the ultimate feminine face of God. Of all the symbols Jesus could have chosen in the last 24 hours of his life, he chose this symbol to represent the feminine face of the divine by saying he would feed us from his own body and blood. This is what I call Christa consciousness. This is the kind of the complementary part of Christ consciousness. And so the mother is she who can conceive and carry and give birth from her own body, literally make from her own body, carry in her own body, birth from her own body, and then feed from her own body. And here's Jesus Christ instituting that at the Last Supper. So the first sacrament is representing the feminine face of God. When you see, you're in the presence of Eucharist, when you see 4 code words. When you hear, wherever it happens in the New Testament, that he took, he blessed, he broke, and he distributed, you're in the presence of a Eucharistic encounter. And so to take means to receive lovingly from Mother God, or from Mother Gaia, not to grab or to kind of control resources, but to take lovingly, to accept lovingly. So he took, he blessed. And I keep saying to you that blessing is not imparting of benediction to a previously inert substance. Blessing is recognizing the inherent sanctity of everything we encounter. And so he blessed the bread and the wine, not in the sense that he says, I bless you, I take this dumb bread and this silly wine, and I'm going to kind of transform it and bless it. Rather, he's recognizing the inherent sanctity of everything that Mother Earth gives to us. So he blesses in the sense of he recognizes. And then he broke, and broke is the intention of sharing with others. And then finally, he distributed, he gave it to everybody who was present. And this is meant to be done not just, ritualistically at a Eucharist, but sociologically in a world of poverty where many millions of children are going to go to bed hungry tonight while we're stashing, mountains of butter in the European Union and paying American farmers to not grow food. So that is what Eucharist represents. Then the second sacrament coming out of Holy Thursday was the sacrament of priesthood. And I've said to you many times that there are 4 stages to any ministry, including priesthood. And that is that there is a need in a community. Secondly, that there's a volunteer who agrees to address that need. Thirdly, that person is trained to do the job. And then fourthly, the community commissions that person to act in that capacity on its behalf. So wherever you find a need, a volunteer, training and commissioning, you have priesthood. And so anybody in any community who fulfills those 4 pieces is a priest for the group. Now, that was the reason that the women had to be written out of the Last Supper. Talk about a totally ridiculous notion that there was going to be a Seder meal with no women present. It's like having Christmas dinner with no mother present, or like having a Thanksgiving meal with no mother present. So why did it have to keep the women out of the room for that occasion? Because during that, as Jesus had created other sacraments, he says, do this in memory of me. He was commissioning everybody present at that meal to be priests. And so you couldn't have the women there, because if the women were present and Christ said, do this in memory of me, that would include the women as well, and they would have a right to priesthood. So you had to write them out of it and pretend like there was a Seder meal with no women present. I mean, it's absolutely ludicrous to think about that. So do this in memory of me was the official ordination ceremony of those who attended that Seder meal. And it included all of the women, including his own mother and Mary of Magdala. Now there's a third sacrament that happened at the Holy Thursday, and we never think about it as a sacrament. And I call it's the Sacrament of Service, where Jesus washes the feet of the disciples. I call it the Sacrament of Service. Now, I remember when we did this ceremony of the washing of the feet when I was in Kenya, it was a real washing. Here it's the kind of symbolic. Even when we did it in church in Palo Alto, I'm sure everybody was really careful to make sure they had washed their feet before they came and used clean socks and stuff like that. And then they'd come, you'd have a basin of water and you'd present these very, very nice feet into the water and you'd wash it. It wasn't like that in Kenya, let me tell you. People would trek 15, 20 miles to get to church for Holy Thursday with no shoes or just sandals, covered in absolute dust. And when you washed their feet, you were really washing their feet. After every one person, you had to dump the water, and get fresh water. And I remember on one occasion, one old lady, putting her foot into the basin, and I'm washing furiously, and she looks down kind of critically, and she says, "You missed that piece down there." And I had to go around and look, between her big toe and the next toe to get a fish out a whole bunch of dust from that. So that was a real ceremony. That was it wasn't a symbol of a symbol of a symbol. So there's the sacrament of service is the third great sacrament. Now, in a way, the early church really understood the sacrament of service. And so when you think about it, education is a sacrament of service. You had the monks in the Middle Ages creating all of the first great universities of Europe. So they created a sacrament of service to educate people. You had the nuns particularly starting, schools for secondary schools for kids and primary schools for kids. You had healing services, the first great hospitals and hospices, very often started by holy women. And then you had agriculture, which was pretty much, given to the masses by the great monastic orders who perfected agriculture. And so when you think about the sacrament of service, there are many, many prongs in which they were really of service in practical ways. And it's one of the things we were taught to do in the seminary as a missionary priest. You don't go out just to baptize people, or to read them tracts from the catechism. You attend to their physical needs, their medical needs, their agricultural needs. And that's what we attempted to do, our particular group. I worked with the Medical Missionaries of Mary, an Irish group who did safari clinics every day of the week and had a little hospital as well. And so the Sacrament of Service was a place in which women were allowed to shine, even though they were refused permission to serve in the other ways. So that's what it looked like Holy Thursday for me. And then, unfortunately, Holy Thursday ends with, this, what I call the mother of all panic attacks, where Jesus leaves to go into the Garden of Gethsemane, and he's going to be tempted for the last time by Satan, and all of the disciples are fast asleep. And he's having such a panic that he's actually sweating blood. And it feels to me like there's a modern word in the intelligence community called psyops, psychological operations, where you try to devastate somebody psychologically. This feels to me like what Satan was doing at this stage. He started tempting Jesus way back in the desert at the beginning of his public ministry. There was 3 great temptations then. Now there's the temptation in the garden, and there'll be one more temptation on Good Friday on the cross. And so I want to take that temptation of Jesus and that in my reading. And I'm not so sure I can get through this without breaking down, which is why I kept it for the end of the homily. And there was an experience I had, a vision, if you want to call it a vision, on the October the 7th in 1979. I was living in a mission in Kenya called Kituro, and I just come back. It was a Sunday, all day saying safari masses, and I'm sitting in the little chapel with just the sanctuary light lighting up, 43 years ago. And I call it the Garden Revisited. On the lips of bronze old-timers back from the dust of the battle, it had a tropical, intriguing mystique. In books, it sounded exhilarating, a heady, inspiring challenge to a young seminarian with a heart full of ideas and precious little experience. But now, Lord, that I have tasted myself, I am aware only of the pain of it, the empty, uncertain agony of being alone, lonely, and celibate. Tomorrow, Lord, I'll be 33 years old. By then, you were ready to lay down your life. But tonight, Sunday night, I'm still only 32. I have been celebrating masses and preaching from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. on an empty belly. The nearest priest is 30 miles away, and my heart is aching for someone to talk to. Only the flickering sanctuary lamp indicates a presence who will listen. So listen, Lord. Answer me honestly. I don't want sweet words. I want the truth. Have you never felt the weakness and the vulnerability of yourself, listlessly soaking away the energy of you? Have you never agonized on whether or not you can remain faithful forever to the vocation the Father has given you? Forever is a lot of days, Lord. Forever is longer than history. Have you never craved to gather in a manly embrace a living, throbbing, loving woman? If you haven't, Lord, then we are completely different. And I don't believe you ever became a man. When you spoke of resurrection, did you have some special knowledge? Or were you operating, as I am, only on faith? The wind rattled the corrugated iron roofing and then was still. The endless chirping of the cricket stopped suddenly, and there was a loud, pulsating silence. And he was there in the middle of it, and he was speaking. Come with me into the garden. Over there lie Peter, John, and James, sleeping. Leave them be. I want you to watch with me. Judas is in town making final arrangements, and the prince of this world is armed for the battle. Now I want you to listen. He threw himself full length upon the ground. It reminded me of an ordination scene. And a great oppressive heaviness came upon him. I could feel it in myself, the lonely, searing agony of temptation, draining joy and draining life. There was a sinister chuckle, and I was aware of the presence of the Tempter. He interrogated Jesus, and this was their conversation. One more day, Emmanuel. Correction, 20 more hours. How does the hero feel? You'll make a lovely corpse, thorn-pricked, whiplashed, nail-studded, and also very, very dead. And for whom? For Peter? No, not for Peter. Not for that garrulous buffoon who'll swear in his awful Galilean accent that he never even heard of you. For Judas, perhaps? Ah, yes. This corpse is dedicated in love to my good friend, Judas the Iscariot. Yes, indeed. My son, Judas. Caught you all napping, did Judas? Yes, I'm so proud of him. Or perhaps it was for John. Ah, John is special to you. Rosy-cheeked, beardless, innocent little John. He'll remember you all right. For a year or two anyway. But time is a great healer. Time is my greatest ally. So time will cure John. He'll go back to his boat. He'll get himself a nice, comforting little wife, and later on, he'll tell his grandchildren about a long-forgotten legend called Jesus, who nearly became the Messiah. Come on, man, think. 33 years old, and what have you done? Jesus groaned, and in a very little voice replied almost to himself, I've healed the blind, the lame, the leprous. They at least will remember. The tempter sat on a rock near the still prostrate form and sarcastically rejoined, very good, excellent. So you healed 200 or perhaps 300 people in a tiny corner of a despised country at a microscopic moment of history? Great. What about the millions who are still blind and lame and leprous? Reflect, O gentle, sensitive, loving one, on the billions of people still to be born who will curse their infirmities and heap vitriol on the day of their birth. No, cut the crap. Don't tell me about healing. Tell me about a real accomplishment. Jesus stammered, I brought joy and freedom to Magdalene, Zacchaeus, Levi, and many others. The tempter scoffed. Magdalene is a fool, a soft-hearted, easily swayed fool. She loves passionately and forgets quickly. Let me tell you what will become of your precious little Magdalene of the dark, seductive eyes. She'll fall in love with Judas. Mr. and Mrs. Simon Iscariot announced the wedding of their eldest son, Judas, to Miss Mary Magdalene. He for the second time, she for the first. Reception to be held in the upper room. Turbans and evening gowns, please. Won't that be nice? And wait for it. They'll call their firstborn son Jesus. Sorry, you're going to have to do better than that. Come on, you're 33. You must have done something. Jesus was sobbing brokenly by now. Large beads of blood-tinged, salt-flavored sweat trickled into his eyes and the corner of his mouth. In a barely audible whisper, he ventured, I raised the widow's son, the little girl of Jairus, and my friend Lazarus to life. The tempter clicked his tongue appreciatively. Now, that was dramatic. I admit it. Lazarus, stinking to high heaven, shuffling cloth coiled out of the cavern to the delight of the fans and the swooning of the more sensitive souls. Standing gowlishly swathed in fetid bandages and covered in flies and ants, swaying slightly in the sultry mid-air as Martha, with one hand on her nose, unwrapped the putrid linen strips. No wonder the religious leaders wanted to kill you. I have never in my life witnessed a more disgusting spectacle. And you realize, of course, that I'll catch up with them all again when you have gone through with your thinly disguised, savior-scented suicide. What about making it a double event? Say, Martha and Lazarus to die on the same day. Yes, I like it. Lazarus and Martha at their home in Bethany, he for the second time, she for the first, deeply regretted by their loving sister, Mary. You did a great disservice there, I'm afraid. Dying is bad enough, but having to do it twice? That's heartless. And speaking of resurrection, are you sure you're going to rise yourself? What guarantee have you got? None, my friend, except a stupidly childish belief in the Father. The Father. What the hell has the Father ever done for you up to now? He has failed you miserably. The elders despise you, the priests detest you, and the few who were willing to follow you were turned off by the "my body is the bread of life" crap. Face up to it, man. You're a dead loss. My advice is this: run from this city, flee this country. 19 hours left now. It could be 19 years or 59 years if you do it my way. Get up. Get up off the bloody ground and do something. Jesus struggled to his knees and hoarsely shouted, "Stop it! Stop it! Stop it! I can't take it anymore." The tempter shoved his face grotesquely to within an inch of Jesus' sweat-streaked, straggly, bearded countenance and spat out the words, "Stop it yourself, for Christ's sake! You stop it! You! You head in the clouds, blind buffoon! You pitiable laughingstock, you!" I jumped up and I caught the tempter by the shoulder and pulled him away. With all the venom I could command, I roared, "Begone, Satan! Begone, you destroyer of mankind, you author of lies, of hatred and dissension. Leave this dying Savior to make his peace with his Father." And he left, sneering at the sobbing form. Jesus lifted his eyes piteously to the twinkling stars and begged, "Father, Father, why have you abandoned me? Take this awful black uncertainty from me. Let me know again why I am to do what I am to do. Help me. Abba, please help me. Explain to me again, please." I knelt at his side. He looked exhaustedly through tear-matted lashes, and I knew that he needed an answer. I said, "Lord, it was good for me to be here. Now I know that you are real. I have seen that you are a man like me. Now, Lord, I can try to follow you."